Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk about A24's new film coming out in a couple of months called A Different Man. Now, I was lucky enough to see this at Melbourne International Film Festival early, and I am so excited because this ended up being one of my favorite films of the year. This is right up there. By the end of this year, this may actually be my favorite film of the year. I absolutely loved it. A24 is back with another harrowing, bleak, perplexing movie, and I just love it. So I'm gonna today give a spoiler-free review, just some quick initial impressions, but really the bulk of this video, the meat and potatoes of this video, are going to be in-depth analysis, character breakdowns, and just exploring how the plot unravels and what I make of it all, because I think this is a super interesting movie. So for those of you who don't know, A Different Man stars Sebastian Stan. He is playing a character named Edward who is living with a physical disability, a physical disfigurement. His face is full of tumors that he can't remove. And the plot is very fly on the wall for the first half of the movie. You are kind of just observing his existence, how he navigates the world, how other people see him. The movie is obsessed with identity and your own self-perception and how other people perceive you. And the story takes a massive turn at the midway point where he finds out there is a operation he can undergo to change his face and become a different man. Now, in my opinion, that is as much as you should know going into the movie. Any more than that feels like a spoiler, despite how much the trailer shows. Now, the funny thing is, I do think the trailer shows too much. However, you still can't picture where this movie is going and the places it explores based off that trailer. So my preference would be you know that much. However, if you are still intrigued and want to know a bit more, here's where the movie goes from there without getting into massive spoilers. So basically, he gets the operation and he comes out looking, you know, like a very attractive guy. He comes out looking like Sebastian Stan, and the movie follows kind of him trying to reacclimate and readjust to society and how people treat him now that he's different. And this movie sort of explores the idea that people weren't just judging him on his physical appearance, but they were also judging him on the person he was inside. You know, now that he doesn't have this physical disfigurement, he is forced to reflect on whether he just gave people the ick because of who he was on the inside. Super fascinating. Now, the movie really gets moving where Edward's character finds out that there is actually a play being written and performed by his neighbor who knew him, this girl next door, played by the worst person in the world. And basically, Edward, Sebastian Stan's character, with his new appearance, auditions for the role to play this fictionalized version of himself. And yeah, in my opinion, giving away any more is absolutely spoiler territory. If you're not intrigued at this point, I don't know how you couldn't be, because it's such an interesting plot. It has so much to say. The thing I love about this movie is it doesn't give you super simple answers. You know, a lot of this movie is exploring the topic of disability, of living with a disability, living with a deformity. It also explores the idea of like ableist casting in Hollywood. You know, in this movie, Sebastian Stan is actually working with prosthetic makeup to appear as the original Edward, right? And the movie questions that. Like, the movie engages in that, right? The movie has a character who is basically putting on makeup and doing an ableist performance, but it's also challenging that. A lot of the movie really is questioning the ethics and morality around that, especially when there are multiple characters throughout this movie who are sidelined with actual real-life physical disabilities. And the movie doesn't steer away from this subject despite the fact that it is engaging in that practice. You know, Aaron Schimberg himself lives with a physical disability. He has cleft palate, and it's really interesting because if you watch interviews with him, he talked about the idea for this movie actually came from the fact that when he made his original film with predominantly physically disabled characters and actors, he was actually criticized for casting them to play disabled characters and defining them by their disability. You know, he talked about the idea that he felt like he couldn't win. He was always in between a rock and a hard place. You know, if he cast able-bodied actors as disabled characters, there was criticism, and if he cast disabled actors as disabled characters, there was also criticism. And this movie, he said, was meant to explore that kind of difficulty and present both. So in this movie, you have Sebastian Stan, who is in makeup. He is an able-bodied actor playing a disabled character, and that is like predominantly most of the movie, right? However, at the same time, this movie has a large variety of actually disabled actors playing disabled characters and exploring that subject matter with a lot of weight and gravity and depth.
Not many, but some people said the film was sort of inherently exploitative just by casting Adam Pearson and casting other people with disabilities and disfigurements which is an issue that I have a cleft palate, and it's always been a sort of lifelong interest for me. So I thought, that criticism stung a little bit because it's sort of the opposite of what we think of as representation. Having somebody with a disfigurement play themselves, if that's not okay, and then we have this other. We still, of course, cast able-bodied people in makeup or whatever. That's still done, but that seems problematic to use a fashionable term in its own way, and so it almost seemed like this is just something people don't want to see at all, or that it was there's a subset of the population that's just not allowed to be represented.
And I really appreciate how far this movie is willing to go in terms of exploring this subject matter. On top of that, I think in terms of disability representation, I really appreciate the fact that this movie isn't super black and white. There are some characters who are really challenging and dark. And even though you have some inbuilt empathy for their situation, for their character from the jump due to what they have to deal with, they're quite challenging characters. There are very few characters in this movie that you feel like you have a consistent read on their morality and who they are as a person. And I really like that about this movie, particularly the character played by the worst person in the world. She is absolutely fantastic, and I am still questioning how I feel about her character, how I feel about her intentions. Super, super fascinating. So if this premise intrigues you, I guarantee you will not be disappointed. This film is funny and dark and challenging and mysterious, and it's equal parts funny as it is sad and horrifying. It doesn't just take predictable turns. This isn't just a modern retelling of The Elephant Man. This movie is bleak and cruel and has a really dark, twisted sense of humor, and also really challenges your preconceptions going into the film. I think it really wants to toy with the audience. It was really fascinating to see how certain jokes played with a massive audience at the Melbourne International Film Festival, because you could tell there was some discomfort there, and the movie is really trying to explore that. So all in all, if you are interested in this premise, please see this movie. I think it's absolutely fantastic, and I think it's A24's best film in years. And don't get me wrong, I love A24. I love Civil War. I love The Lighthouse. I loved After Sun, but this is a genuine standout in an already great catalog, in my opinion. Now, for those of you who have seen the film, let's really get into the nitty-gritty of the plot and character turns. So there are 3 core characters by the end of this movie, right? There's Edward, played by Sebastian Stan. There's Oswald, played by Adam Pearson. And there's Ingrid, played by Renata Rensby. She is the worst person in the world. What a great kind of small isolated cast. My God, all 3 of these characters are just super interesting, super well explored, super well fleshed out, and the way they all bounce off each other and kind of pick at each other and challenge each other is super interesting. Let me just quickly burn through the plot, right? So Edward at the start of the film has this neighbor called Ingrid, and she sort of likes Edward, but you can't really tell. They have a brief interaction where Edward misreads a situation and leans in for a kiss, and it kind of panics her. She gets flustered, and they kind of don't talk too much after that. Basically, from there, Edward basically starts taking this experimental medication and goes through this experimental procedure, which results in his tumors essentially ripping off. There is this fantastic scene where he pulls through his disfigurement. He pulls through the tumors as they're slowly coming off. It's this very David Cronenberg, horrifying but also beautiful sequence where he emerges. Super fascinating. I absolutely love it. Even if you can't one-to-one relate to Edward's plight, I think we've all had that moment of wanting to kind of rip through our skin and wanting to be a different person. And I think the way this is visualized is just so fascinating and equal parts horrifying. Garnered a massive response from the crowd as it was happening, and it feels genuinely surreal. I really appreciate how long we actually spend with Edward while he has his physical impairment. It's super fascinating. And I think the fact that later on in the movie we meet Adam Pearson's character, the questions that brings up, the morality it explores is really, really fascinating. But basically from there, right, Edward, after essentially losing his disfigurement, shedding his disfigurement, so to speak, from there, right, he actually fakes his own death, right? Edward, who now looks like Sebastian Stan, basically tells people that the original Edward is no longer with us. He passed away. Super, super interesting. And the reason that's interesting is because the doctor actually comes back to check up on him and is clearly disappointed with the fact that like he can't check how that procedure, how that medication went. So interesting from Edward as a character that he is potentially, you know, denying the world this life-changing treatment, this life-changing medical breakthrough by lying and pretending that the guy actually died. Super tragic and yeah, really, really interesting, right? Because on one hand, you totally get that Edward just wants to start a new life as a new person and not be tied to who he used to be. But at the same time, like it feels, you can't help but feel like it's a very selfish decision. You also notice that Ingrid seems noticeably upset that the original Edward is no longer with us. She believes the story that that original Edward is actually gone and no longer with us. Super, super interesting. Basically, speed running the plot from there, right? You find out that Ingrid over the years has started to develop a play based on Edward's original life, the original Edward that she started to know based on his life and what she knew of him. And very important to note, throughout the play, she makes it seem like they had a super involved kind of love story. She had an infatuation with him that was never realized. She makes herself look like a really, really good person. She also dumbs down a lot of their interactions. So at this point, the movie really is saying a lot about how, you know, able-bodied people often love to tell the stories of disabled people without much insight and knowledge. And it creates this really interesting tension, right? Because Edward, now looking like Sebastian Stan and pretending to be someone else, decides to actually audition for the role of his previous self. Very meta, right? And he can't play it. Like, they think he's doing a bad job. They don't want to hire him as the role. Super, super interesting. And he starts making demands about the script and saying that, like, you know, I don't feel like Edward would say this.
How we idealize people when we're in love.
So I'm the idolized version of Oswald?
And you're waiting for him the whole movie to kind of like burst out and say, hey, I am Edward. Like, I'm actually Edward, and you need to listen to me about what I think I would have said, right? Because this woman is telling his story and kind of telling it in a very condescending and insulting way. Again, a very interesting commentary on ableism in Hollywood and the way that Hollywood absolutely loves to kind of like tell, you know, disabled people's stories in a way that makes the able-bodied people look like heroes. It's super fascinating watching Edward, who underwent this surgery like intentionally, right? You know, and left his old self behind and couldn't even admit to the world that, you know, he changed this about himself, you know, challenging Ingrid and saying like, hey, like, this isn't how my character would be. But he can't actually just come out and admit what he's done and who he really is. Really fascinating. And one of my favorite things about this movie is you never get that moment.
Hi, thanks for the great film. I guess, like, I feel like this is the type of film where normally there would be a big, like, he would reveal to himself, to everyone, that he's Edward, but I guess the film doesn't really need that. Was that ever really in the script, I guess? And I guess what made you decide, like, not to do that if you did think of that in the first place?
No, I never wanted to go there, but I think the consideration of, I knew that there would be that expectation, you know, like him, you know, he finally reveals himself to Ingrid. So I really tried to come up with ways where you would stop thinking about that, or where that wouldn't matter anymore, so that it didn't bog the film down waiting for this revelation. So I just sort of threw more things in there to make us forget that this was even an issue.
You never get that moment where he finally cracks it and admits to Ingrid who he really is, even though it would be really easy for him to do, especially given the fact that Ingrid almost posthumously, right? Ingrid, almost looking back retroactively, is seemingly in love with the idea of who Edward was. I find Ingrid's character really, really interesting, and we will get to her when I go character by character for my character by character breakdown. So the film basically explores Edward's plight as he's trying to play his former self in this fictionalized version of his own life, right? And then eventually this guy named Oswald shows up, played by Adam Pearson, who in real life, the actor, actually has this disfigurement, actually has this condition. He kind of interrupts a rehearsal and says, oh my God, Edward, I absolutely love what you're doing with this role. I absolutely love it. You're absolutely crushing it. And this is where the movie really gets interesting, right? Because Oswald is super well liked. Everybody loves him. except Edward. And the reason Edward doesn't like him, at least what it feels like to me, is because Edward sees that Oswald is getting along with people so well socially. And it seems like Edward used to feel like people didn't like him because of his physical disfigurement, because of how he looked with his condition. And it slowly starts to dawn on him that like, oh my God, Oswald has the same disfigurement and everyone loves him and no one seemed to love me. Is it because I was a bit of an asshole? Because people don't like me now, even though I looked like Sebastian Stan. Oh my God, was it me the whole time? But he's so kind of self-righteous that he can't admit that to himself. And it's really interesting because even though Edward is portrayed as a bit of a dick, and it feels like the point of the movie is that, like, you know, he was his own worst enemy, whether he had his disfigurement or not. You do kind of feel for him. It's equal parts a very challenging character, a very nasty character, but you do kind of get how much that would suck, how much that realization would suck. And I think the movie is also really doing a good job of playing with your own sort of preconceptions. You know, going into the movie, when you're watching Edward's life at the start of the film, you can't help but feel bad for him due to, you know, the life he has to live. However, he's noticeably a shitty dude at times. He's also a rubbish actor. You see him in auditions and he sucks. And I think it's really kind of fascinating that the movie really kind of wants to make him the butt of the joke as the movie goes on. It feels like the movie starts to punish him for the choice to kind of remove his disfigurement and go through with this treatment because life just constantly shits on him. And he has to watch Oswald from afar, you know, crush it socially, and people worship him. And Ingrid, you know, pursues Oswald romantically, even though she never pursued Edward romantically while he was alive. And I really find just the conflicts that are brought up in this movie just so fascinating. But the movie basically crescendos where Oswald is eventually picked as a better person to play Edward due to the fact that he is actually living with his physical disfigurement. And of course, it sucks for Edward because he just wants to scream out, well, I'm the real Edward, and I also had this disfigurement. How are you going to tell me that I don't know what it's like? But he can't do it because he doesn't want to admit to people who he used to be. He wants to leave that part of himself behind. So Oswald eventually starts playing the old Edward in this play. Ingrid has made this really ableist, self-involved version of Edward's life where she looks awesome. And Edward is just this sympathy, pity sponge for people to kind of like pity and look down on and feel bad for. And it's rubbing Edward the wrong way. This leads to a series of events and kind of a montage where eventually Edward snaps and has a mental breakdown and gets in a fight with Oswald on stage where he suffers now, you know, debilitating injuries. So now, you know, despite his best efforts, he is living with, you know, disabilities again. And while kind of recovering from this, he has a mental breakdown and stabs someone while living with Oswald and Ingrid. He stabs his physio who's trying to help him get better. From there, Edward eventually goes to prison and re-emerges back into society maybe like a decade or two later, and now starts hanging out with Oswald and Ingrid again. So after living with them, after getting his injuries, he's now kind of hanging out with them again after re-emerging into society. The movie ends here while he's sitting there in a conversation, and I think Oswald says something along the lines of like, oh, you've never changed, you're still good old Edward. I think the point of this ending, the fact that Edward can't seem to leave Oswald and Ingrid alone, is this idea that even though Edward physically left his old self behind, he kind of can't leave Ingrid and Oswald behind because they have this weird connection to who he used to be. Even if it's this fictionalized, insulting, condescending idea of who he used to be, they're the only people that seem to have any idea of who he used to be, even, you know, without actually knowing that he is the old Edward. And it seems like he wants to hang around that because it's some level of like physical attachment. Now, important to note about Edward, we never find out where his family is. Maybe he was abandoned, maybe he was orphaned. There's this really interesting scene at the start of the movie. Absolutely love this scene where when Ingrid comes over to his apartment while Edward still looks like the original Edward, she sees a photo on the wall of a mother and a child, and he says, oh yeah, that's me and my mum. And she goes, oh really? oh, and it's clear to us as an audience, she's sitting there questioning like, oh, so you didn't look like that as a baby. Is that really you? And they don't spell that out to us as an audience. That's just for like observant audience members to figure out. But the really interesting thing is later in the movie, she presents that scene in her play, and in the play, it's a lot more unsubtle, right? So in the play, she goes, oh, so you weren't born like this. Oh, okay. Oh, and he goes, no. And so it's like, we don't actually know if that's true or not. I read the scene initially as maybe as this stock photo or a photo from a magazine where he pretends that's him and his mother, or maybe it really is him and his mother. And the movie never gives us an answer to that. And I really like that this movie never really holds our hand in terms of these sort of like lingering questions. You know, where is Edward's family? What is his relationship with his family like? We never find that out. We also never really find out, you know, why exactly he never wanted to tell people that he's gone, why he would rather be dead rather than admit to people that he, you know, went through this operation. Super interesting. The movie also never really interrogates him for the, you know, potential impact it has on other people living with his disfigurement that might want to go through that operation. And I really like how this movie just kind of like shows things and leaves it to you as an audience to kind of sit with it and kind of question the morality of these characters. And there is no better example to talk about these sort of moral questions than Ingrid, in my opinion. So I find Ingrid's character just incredibly hard to pin down in a really, really good way. So there's this really fascinating scene early on in the movie, right, where she goes over to Edward's apartment and they're hanging out on the couch and she looks at Edward. And I'm trying to be delicate, but to put it bluntly, Edward has a very clear physical deformity, right? Like you cannot avoid how his face looks. And I found this moment really touching where Ingrid looks at him and goes, oh, your skin's really dry. Let me give you this cream for your face. I found it really, really sweet. And I found it interesting because the rest of my audience laughed at this scene as if she was being kind of insensitive or insulting, or almost this air of like, oh, why would he care about his skin when, you know, he looks like this? But to me, it felt like a really, really sweet, earnest moment. And after she applies the cream or touches his face to check how dry it is, he kind of quivers his lips and leans in ever so slightly, almost as like a misread that he thought she might have been going for a kiss. She freaks out from there and goes, oh, you've misread it. And it's very awkward, and the kind of hangout ends there. Now, I thought she was a bit harsh with rushing off, in my opinion. He didn't hold her down or really go in for a kiss. He kind of just like awkwardly paused. But regardless, what I found interesting is how you read her character from there. Because watching an interview with the actress that plays her, she actually said that, you know, she rejects him because of how he looks. Like, she made it abundantly clear, the actress, that is why she rejected him.
Yeah, she's a kind of a girl next door, very kind, very a good person. She doesn't really let herself fall in love with her neighbor, that Sebastian played, Edward, in the beginning, and she has a very strong vision for her life. She wants to be a director and a writer. But because of how he looks, I don't think she allows herself to fall in love. And then when he disappears, she gets obsessed by telling his story and taking his story.
Which I found really interesting because I found her interactions with Edward early in the movie genuinely really sweet. And the reason I say all this is because I thought for a good chunk of this movie, her character was just completely morally reprehensible. The fact that she makes this play where she makes herself look like a really good person, makes herself look so much more interested in Edward, and you know, makes it look like they actually kissed and they started a romantic relationship, and, you know, fills in gaps that Edward never filled in to her, and makes his story way sadder, and like fills out. I just found it so morally questionable and icky. But the thing I like about this movie is it doesn't really, you know, paint these situations as 100% morally good or morally bad. You know, her character goes on a journey over multiple decades. You know, initially she's presented as a really sweet, caring character. You know, then she feels really juvenile and self-involved. But then in this really interesting moment towards the end of the movie, this scene where she asks Sebastian Stan's Edward to have sex with her wearing the mask of the original Edward, and she doesn't know that Sebastian Stan is actually the original Edward. So she's getting this random guy who is playing Edward to wear an Edward mask, right, with the original deformity and fuck her, right? And it's an absolutely insane scene. She starts laughing at him as well. And it's just horrifying. You know, it says a lot about her character that she would want to do something like that, especially when she didn't get with Edward in real life when she had the chance and kind of run off from him when he made a romantic pass at her. I thought this scene where she asks Sebastian Stan to put on a mask of him was just evil, like insanely fucked up. On top of that, there's this really interesting moment where Edward, the original Edward, gives her this typewriter to write her scripts. She writes a letter to him saying thank you and says, oh, guess what I wrote this on? But then later on in the movie, she confesses to Sebastian Stan's character, the new Edward, not knowing that it's the original Edward. She confesses to him, oh, I don't know who gave me that typewriter, I've never used it. Now, this is either a lie where she's kind of like hiding the fact that she did actually know this real life Edward and doesn't want to tell the new Edward, which I found really strange, or she lied to the original Edward and she actually never used that typewriter, and either one feels really cruel and strange. And so her character throughout this movie, you're sitting there going, oh wow, the woman who played the worst person in the world is yet again the worst person in the world. She sucks. But then at the end of the movie, she actually starts a relationship with Oswald. She starts dating Oswald. She falls in love with Oswald. And it doesn't feel like she has this disability fetish. It isn't played in this way where it's like, oh, she's just obsessed with these people that look like this way and she wants to feel like a really good person. And the reason I say that is because in the closing sections of the film, she actually talks to Oswald and Edward about the fact that like she wishes the play was never made. She just thinks it was so morally wrong and reprehensible of her, and she looks back on it with such shame. Just so fascinating that they're willing to kind of present this character as really good and then really like make her just morally gross and then kind of like redeem her in a really natural feeling way. And you see this journey of her as she's, you know, struggling with her identity and her place in Edward's story. And I just think it's really fascinating.
She gets obsessed by telling his story and taking his story. And she's kind of lost for a little bit. And then she meets Oswald. He comes into the mix of this theater play and he kind of gets her back to the good path. And like, his character is so, he's celebrating himself so much. So she gets so inspired and kind of lets herself be who she is and yeah, becomes happy again.
As a writer, you do probably get wrapped up in your own idea of who people were. I'm sure she did want to be respectful at certain points, but she also did want to create a more fascinating story. And you completely understand her intentions and motivations, even if they feel so fucked up and horrible in the moment. And I really appreciate this kind of like reflection she has because it just makes her character so multi-layered and fascinating. And by the end of the movie, you have no clue how to feel about her. Similar with Edward, right? Like, on one hand, you want to have this reading of like, oh, Edward's just a dick and that's why people don't like him. He was a dick when he had his disfigurement. He was a dick without his disfigurement and he just rubs people the wrong way. But that's not exactly true. I think when he had his disfigurement, he did come off as really sweet. And yes, he wasn't a great actor and he was a bit weird socially, but I mean, can you blame him? Like, it's probably a really hard existence. You see these long sections of him on the train and people staring at him. However, what I absolutely love is when he looks like Sebastian Stan, right? An objectively hot dude. He's on the train and someone is staring at him and looking at him again, despite the fact that he doesn't have a physical disfigurement. And the reason they're looking at him is because on the roof of the subway, there's an advertisement of his where people have drawn a Hitler stash on him. Super fascinating. I absolutely love it. And there is this insane sequence where he starts wearing this mask of the old Edward. This mask, by the way, was created because when he was getting the operation, they made a mold of his face to basically study and replicate and whatever, right? So now he goes around and starts wearing it so he can live as his old self, who he used to be. And he starts trying to sell houses and starts trying to be a real estate agent with this mask on, and just watching how he polarizes people. But it's like, he's not polarizing people because of the mask he's wearing, because of how he looks. He's polarizing people because he's just losing his shit and coming off as a massive asshole. So yeah, I found his character just so fascinating and well realized. And going into the movie, I actually thought that Sebastian Stan's original character, Edward, so when he had his physical prosthetic makeup on, I actually thought that was played by Adam Pearson. And then Sebastian Stan played the version of Edward without the physical disfigurement. But no, Adam Pearson is his own character, Oswald, and Sebastian Stan is a different person with a different physical deformity. So that was just my bad. I misread the trailer, but super fascinating. I love the horror and the envy that Sebastian Stan's Edward starts to feel when he sees someone with a similar physical deformity, you know, doing well in life, connecting with people, having multiple wives, having a child, and just being the life of the party wherever he goes. You know, and Sebastian Stan's Edward realizing like, fuck, I was never able to connect with people that way, and I still can't, you know? And I just love the idea that by the end of the movie, Oswald is now playing Edward better than Edward could, and Edward's struggling with his story. But it's like, you know what, dude? Like, you gave up on yourself, you know, you told the world you were dead, you gave up on your story, and you still can't admit to people who you really were because you're so desperate to leave that behind. But simultaneously, you want to hang out with Oswald and Ingrid, even though it's killing you, because they're the only people that feel like they knew you. Oh my God, so much interesting stuff in this movie. And finally, let's talk about Oswald, played by Adam Pearson. What an incredible performance, incredible character. I love all the interviews with Oswald. It feels like he's very much similar in real life to how he is in this movie.
I'm a huge
Really?
podcast guy. Yeah. Am I allowed to sound like Joe Rogan, or is that going to get me cancelled?
Maybe.
Maybe, okay. I know who Joe Rogan is. I'll meet you all halfway.
Smartless is really good.
The director has said in interviews that he actually wrote this movie because he wanted to give a massive part to Adam Pearson. Apparently every movie he makes, he has Adam Pearson in mind. For those of you who might recognize Adam Pearson, he was also in Scarlett Johansson's Under the Skin. Incredibly talented actor. He is phenomenal here. Do not get it twisted. He is absolutely fantastic. If everything is right in the world, Sebastian Stan will be up for lead actor at this year's Oscars. And in my opinion, Adam Pearson should also be up for Best Supporting Actor. What a hell of a double role. I also love that Oswald is held back from the audience for a long time. He has a surprise reveal. You actually don't see it coming if you haven't seen the trailer, that someone else with Edward's initial physical deformity is going to show up. And it doesn't feel contrived either. It makes total sense, because obviously, of course, he would be interested in a play being put on about someone with a similar, if not the same condition as him. Super fascinating. I also love that the poster of this movie isn't Sebastian Stan and Oswald. It's the two Sebastian Stans, the two versions of Sebastian Stan. So I really love that the film holds back on revealing Oswald as a major player in this story until like the halfway point, and it's completely surreal when he shows up. But he is just an incredible character, super layered, super interesting, and I love what it brings out of Sebastian Stan. It's a really ugly nature. The fact that Sebastian Stan's character is like fuming and envious about how well liked Oswald is as a person. What just an interesting movie. So many great performances. The trifecta of these characters is just so interesting. I think this movie absolutely crushes it in terms of what it has to say about representation, what it means to be your true self, and self-acceptance. There's also this really interesting, darkly funny section about kind of like these like ableism commercials that simultaneously feel really condescending, really patronizing and insulting. And a lot of this movie walks this fine line of feeling like a simultaneous critique of things, but also doing the thing that they're critiquing, but in a really interesting way. I, as someone who works in the disability community, just have so many questions, and I found it really, really challenging and yeah, just super, super fascinating. So yeah, I think this movie is a masterpiece. I think whether you know people in the disability community or not, I think it just asks such interesting questions. I think it asks so much of Sebastian Stan as an actor. I think the interviews, by the way, are super fascinating with the cast. I think Adam Pearson is incredible. I think the woman from Worst Person in the World is kind of fantastic and like a real MVP of this movie. I love this movie. I love this movie. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know what you thought of this movie in the comments below. Let me know what your interpretation of these characters was. Thank you so much for watching and have a lovely day.